My grandfather built half these houses with his own 2 hands. She called him a trespasser in front of 40 neighbors. He didn't argue. Walked away. That smile should have terrified her. 3 quiet years of small fines exploded into one public shaming. The next morning, a letter arrived that changed everything. By noon, the entire HOA board was gone. She never saw it coming. Until I did. My name is Sarah Doyle, and I'm a real estate attorney who spent most of her career reading fine print other people never bothered to check. I grew up 2 streets over from my grandfather, Walter Doyle, in a quiet Ohio subdivision called Maple Ridge Estates, the kind of place with cul-de-sacs and flagpoles and a homeowners association nobody used to take seriously. Grandpa Walt was 82, a widower, a Korean War veteran, and the man who'd poured half the concrete in that neighborhood back when it was still a construction site in 1974. He knew every pipe under every street. He also, as it turned out, knew something about that HOA that its current president would have paid dearly to keep buried. Maple Ridge had always run on handshake trust. For decades the board was 3 retirees who mowed the common lawn themselves and mailed a newsletter twice a year. Nobody fought over paint colors. Nobody fined anyone for a garden gnome. That changed the year Deborah Voss moved in and decided the neighborhood needed, in her words, real leadership. Debbie Voss sold luxury condos downtown and treated Maple Ridge like her personal listing photo. She joined the board within 6 months of arriving, became vice president within a year, and by the time her predecessor quietly resigned from exhaustion, she was unanimously elected president, unanimous because she was the only name on the ballot. First, the changes seemed harmless. New mailbox specifications. A ban on visible trash cans before 6 p.m. A curb appeal committee that walked the streets with clipboards. Neighbors grumbled but complied. Debbie framed every rule as protecting property values. And for a while, people believed her because property values did creep upward. My grandfather didn't join the grumbling. He mowed his lawn every Saturday morning, kept his hedges trimmed in perfect right angles, and paid his dues on time, the way he'd done for 30 years. He simply didn't attend the meetings anymore. I built this street, he told me once.
I don't need a permit.
That attitude, harmless as it seemed, put him on Debbie's radar early. She didn't like residents who ignored her committee's authority, and she especially didn't like residents who'd been there longer than the association itself, because it reminded everyone else that the rules were newer than the neighborhood. Debbie's husband, Greg, sat on the board too, as treasurer, which nobody questioned because nobody read the bylaws closely enough to notice that a husband and wife majority on a 5-member board wasn't exactly what checks and balances was supposed to look like. 2 more allies, Frank Torres and a rotating cast of quiet yes votes, filled the rest. The 5th seat belonged to Linda Kwan, a soft-spoken accountant who'd been on the board since before Debbie arrived. Linda kept the real books, the ones that didn't always match the numbers Debbie read aloud at meetings. She rarely spoke up, but she watched everything, and she wrote things down. I visited Grandpa Walt most Sundays for coffee on his porch. The same porch he'd built the frame for himself using leftover lumber from the model home. He'd point out which houses had settled wrong, which driveways he'd poured too thin. Small proud confessions from a man who measured his life in poured concrete and square corners. He mentioned Debbie occasionally, always with amusement rather than anger. "That woman sent me a letter about my garden hose," he said one Sunday, chuckling into his mug. "Said it violated visual clutter standards. I've had a hose in that spot since Nixon was president." I laughed along, not yet understanding how serious she was. What I didn't know then was that Debbie kept a private list, informally, in a spreadsheet only she and Greg could access, of problem residents, ranked by how much they resisted her authority. My grandfather sat near the top, not for anything he'd done, but simply because he refused to be impressed by her. The tension had a slow fuse. Debbie began sending violation notices for things previous boards had never enforced. A birdhouse 2 inches too tall, a flag mounted at the wrong angle, a wind chime deemed audibly disruptive. Fines started at $25 and climbed with every unanswered letter, compounding like a debt nobody agreed to owe. My grandfather ignored the first notice about his garden flag, a small blue ribbon he'd hung the week after my grandmother passed, a keepsake from her memorial service. He assumed it was a clerical mistake. He didn't realize Debbie had personally flagged it during one of her walking inspections, clipboard in hand, cataloging grief as a code violation. Word around the neighborhood was that crossing Debbie meant a slow campaign of harassment. Extra inspections, selectively enforced rules, public call-outs at meetings where she'd read violators' names aloud like a scoreboard. People paid their fines just to avoid becoming her next example. Compliance, not community, held Maple Ridge together now. I should have paid closer attention sooner. But I was buried in cases downtown, and my grandfather insisted he could handle some woman with a clipboard. He'd survived combat overseas. A homeowners association letter didn't register as a threat. That confidence, I'd later realize, was exactly what made him such an easy target. Still, something about the way he mentioned Debbie's name, a flicker of tightness under the humor, told me this wasn't nothing. I made a mental note to look into Maple Ridge's HOA paperwork sometime, purely out of professional curiosity. I had no idea how soon sometime would arrive, or how badly I'd need it. The spark came on a Tuesday in April. Debbie's Curb Appeal Committee photographed my grandfather's memorial flag for the third time and mailed a formal violation notice demanding removal within 72 hours or face escalating fines. Grandpa Walt, reading it on his porch, folded the letter once and set it under his coffee mug. He didn't call me. He simply left the flag exactly where it was, because moving it felt, to him, like moving my grandmother's memory to satisfy a stranger's spreadsheet. 72 hours passed. Nothing happened for 2 more weeks. Then Debbie decided nothing wasn't good enough. At the May general meeting, held in the community clubhouse under fluorescent lights and a banner reading Pride in Maple Ridge, Debbie opened with routine business. Pool hours, landscaping bids, a reminder about mailbox paint. Then she reached the compliance report, a section she'd added to the agenda herself 6 months earlier. She read violator names aloud, one by one, each followed by a fine amount and a smug little pause for effect. Most people squirmed and said nothing. When she reached Walter Doyle, unauthorized yard ornamentation, 30-day non-compliance, my grandfather, sitting quietly near the back, finally raised his hand to speak. "It's not an ornament," he said, voice steady. "It's for my wife." The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something private gets exposed too suddenly. For a moment, even Debbie hesitated, and I like to think a kinder person would have stopped there. She didn't stop. "Walter," she said, loud enough for the back row. "We can't make exceptions just because something has sentimental value. Otherwise, everyone's yard becomes a shrine." A few people laughed nervously. My grandfather said nothing else. He simply sat back down, jaw tight, and stared at his hands. He told me about it that Sunday, downplaying it the way he downplayed everything. "She made her point," he said with a shrug that didn't match his eyes. But I noticed he hadn't touched his coffee. And I noticed, for the first time, that he looked smaller than I remembered him being. That was the night I decided to actually read Maple Ridge's governing documents, the Declaration of Covenants, conditions and restrictions, the bylaws, the meeting minutes going back years. As an attorney, I knew HOAs ran on paperwork most residents never opened. I had a feeling that paperwork was about to become very interesting. I requested the documents through the association's management portal, a formality every homeowner or their representative was entitled to under state law. It took Debbie's office 9 days to respond, well past the legal deadline, and when the packet finally arrived, several pages looked suspiciously recent for documents dated a decade earlier. Meanwhile, the fines on my grandfather's account kept accruing. $30 a week became a lean threat within 2 months, a detail buried in a form letter he almost didn't read twice. HOA, unlike parking tickets, could attach to a property's title, and in the worst cases, force a sale. I explained this to him carefully, watching his face change from stubborn amusement to something closer to alarm. "They can take my house over a garden flag?" he asked, and I had to tell him, honestly, that in the wrong circumstances, with the wrong board, yes, technically, eventually, they could. That was the moment my grandfather stopped treating this like a nuisance and started treating it like a fight. He didn't want to remove the flag. He wanted to understand exactly what gave this woman, a stranger 15 years younger than him, the power to threaten the home he'd built with his own hands. I promised him I'd look into it properly, not as his granddaughter offering comfort, but as an attorney building a file. He nodded slowly, then reached into a hallway closet and pulled out a battered metal lockbox I'd never seen before. "Your grandmother kept the old paperwork," he said.
Might be.
Inside were yellow documents from 1974, the original recorded covenant, founding meeting minutes, and a handwritten ledger listing the neighborhood's first association officers. My grandfather's name was on that list. He hadn't just built the houses. He'd helped write the very rules Debbie was now weaponizing against him. I photographed every page that night at his kitchen table, adrenaline replacing my exhaustion. Something about the original covenant's language felt different from the version Debbie's office had sent me. Specifically, a clause about board elections that seemed to have quietly vanished somewhere between 1974 and today. The original bylaws required a full board election every 2 years, with mailed ballots to all homeowners and a certified vote count witnessed by 2 non-board residents. I couldn't recall Maple Ridge ever holding an election like that in the 6 years Debbie had been president. I made a note to check. I called the county recorder's office the next morning and requested the association's officially filed bylaw amendments. There weren't any. Company distributed to residents wasn't legally filed anywhere. It existed only as a PDF on a private portal, a document with no legal teeth at all. That was small twist number 1. Quiet but seismic. Every fine, Every lien threat, every rule enforced under Debbie's leadership might be resting on a foundation that had never been properly, legally established. I didn't say anything to my grandfather yet. I wanted to be certain before I gave him hope. I spent the next several weeks building a file in the evenings after work, cross-referencing state HOA statutes with Maple Ridge's actual recorded documents. Ohio law was clear. Significant bylaw changes required a homeowner vote and recording with the county. Debbie's compliance regime existed almost entirely outside that legal structure. While I worked quietly, Debbie escalated loudly. My grandfather's fine total crossed $400. A second letter arrived threatening a lien filing within 30 days. He handed it to me at the door, hands trembling slightly, not from fear exactly, but from the particular fury of a proud man being cornered. I told him not to pay it and not to remove the flag. Not yet. Give me time, I said. He trusted me the way grandfathers trust granddaughters who've never let them down, which made the pressure to actually deliver something feel heavier than any case I'd handled downtown. Debbie, unaware anyone was investigating her, grew bolder. She began posting compliance spotlights in the community newsletter, thinly veiled call-outs naming streets, sometimes house numbers, always without names but obvious enough that everyone knew exactly who she meant. My grandfather's street appeared twice in 6 weeks. Neighbors started avoiding him at the mailbox, not out of dislike, but out of the particular cowardice fear breeds. Nobody wanted Debbie's spotlight turned their way next. My grandfather, a man who'd once organized half the block's July 4th barbecues, found himself increasingly, deliberately isolated on the street he built. I started attending meetings myself, sitting quietly in the back with a legal pad, introducing myself only as Walter Doyle's granddaughter, an attorney observing on his behalf. Debbie's smile the first time she noticed me was thin and immediate, the practiced smile of someone recalculating a threat level. At that meeting, she brought up a new proposal, raising fines for repeat noncompliance by 300%, framed as a deterrent against habitual violators. Only 3 homeowners in Maple Ridge's history qualified as repeat, and my grandfather, thanks to one grieving flag, was now officially one of them. I raised my hand and asked, politely, whether the fine increase had been properly noticed to all homeowners per the association's recorded bylaws, and whether those bylaws were, in fact, the legally filed version.
Debbie's composure flickered for half a second before.
I'll follow up with the board directly, I said, smiling the exact way she'd smiled at me. A few neighbors exchanged glances. It was the first time in years, apparently, that anyone had pushed back at a Maple Ridge meeting without immediately backing down when Debbie raised her voice. Afterward, an older woman named Ruth caught up with me in the parking lot. She'd lived at Maple Ridge since the 80s and quietly confided that Debbie had fined her, too, over a rose trellis her late husband installed. Nobody fights her, Ruth whispered. She always wins. Ruth's comment stuck with me. Debbie didn't just enforce rules. She'd built an entire ecosystem of quiet compliance, where fighting back felt pointless because, historically, it had been. Nobody had ever checked whether her authority actually rested on solid legal ground. Nobody, until now, had bothered to read the fine print. I requested Maple Ridge's full financial records next. curious whether Linda Kwan's quiet presence on the board meant anything. The management company stalled again, citing processing delays. Under Ohio law, homeowners were entitled to those records within a set number of days. The delay itself was, technically, another violation. Theirs, not ours. While waiting, I dug into the reserve fund, a pool of money legally required for major repairs like roof replacement and road resurfacing. Public assessment records showed the reserve fund shrinking steadily over the past 3 years, despite dues increasing twice in that same window. Something wasn't adding up. My grandfather, meanwhile, grew quieter at our Sunday visits, the humor draining slowly out of his stories. He still hadn't removed the flag. He'd started, instead, mowing his lawn even more meticulously, trimming his hedges into sharper lines, as if perfect grass might somehow shield him from Debbie's next letter. I hated watching him brace like that, a man who'd once led men under actual gunfire now flinching at certified mail. It lit something cold and precise in me, the same feeling I got prepping for a case I intended to win decisively rather than merely survive. This wasn't going to be a draw. Debbie filed the lien threat formally in June, a legal notice that, if unpaid within 60 days, would attach to my grandfather's property title. She mailed it on a Friday, timed, I later suspected, so it would sit in his mailbox all weekend, marinating in dread before anyone could intervene. He called me Saturday morning, voice tighter than I'd ever heard it. They're really going to take my house, Sarah. I drove over immediately, sat with him at his kitchen table, and told him the truth. I didn't think they legally could, but I needed proof. And proof takes time. How much time? He asked. And I didn't have a good answer. Liens, once filed, were expensive and slow to fight even when wrongful. I promised him I'd move faster. That night I stayed up until 2 a.m. drafting a formal records request under Ohio's HOA transparency statute, citing specific violated deadlines. I also, quietly, reached out to Linda Kwan directly, introducing myself as Walter Doyle's granddaughter and attorney, asking only if she'd be willing to talk. She didn't respond for 3 days. When she finally did, her email was one line, "Call me after 8 p.m. Not from your work number." That single cryptic sentence told me more than any document had so far. Whatever Linda knew, she was afraid of it being traced back to her. I called that night from my personal cell, heart pounding in a way court appearances never managed to produce, and she answered on the first ring. Linda spoke carefully, choosing words like she'd rehearsed them. She confirmed the reserve fund discrepancies were real, that Debbie and Greg had personally approved several large, consulting payments to a company that, as far as Linda could tell, didn't actually exist beyond a P.O. box and an invoice template. She also confirmed no board election had been held since Debbie's initial unanimous vote 6 years earlier. Terms were supposed to renew every 2 years. Debbie had simply, year after year, and nobody had challenged it, because nobody realized challenging it was even an option. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Linda was quiet for a moment. "Because your grandfather was kind to me when I moved in 15 years ago," she said. "And because I'm tired of writing numbers I know are lies." It was the first real crack in Debbie's fortress. I asked Linda if she'd be willing to provide documentation, Not testimony yet, just documents, to corroborate what she'd told me. She hesitated, understandably terrified of Debbie's retaliation, but eventually agreed to quietly forward what she legally had access to as a sitting board member. Treasurer's records included. Over the following 2 weeks, a slow trickle of documents arrived in my personal inbox, spreadsheets, invoice copies, email threads where Debbie explicitly instructed Linda to adjust the presentation of numbers before annual meetings. It wasn't proof of criminal fraud yet, but it was proof of a pattern. Meanwhile, my grandfather's lien deadline crept closer. I filed the formal records demand, citing the association's failure to hold legally required elections and failure to properly file bylaw amendments with the county. A two-pronged argument that, if correct, meant Debbie's entire board lacked legitimate authority to fine anyone. The management company's lawyer responded dismissively at first, calling my request an attempt to relitigate settled association governance. I responded with the original 1974 covenant, the missing county filings, and a formal notice that continued fine collection during a governance dispute could constitute wrongful lien filing under state law. That letter changed the tone considerably. Within a week, the lien threat against my grandfather quietly paused. Pending review, a phrase legal departments use when they suddenly realize they might be more exposed than the person they were threatening. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was the first breath of air. My grandfather noticed the change before I told him why. "No new letters this week," he said cautiously over coffee, like a man testing ice before stepping onto it. I told him progress was happening but asked him to stay patient a little longer, and not to mention any of it to neighbors yet. Debbie, for her part, seemed to sense something shifting even without knowing the specifics. At the next meeting, she was visibly sharper, quicker to shut down questions, quicker to invoke board discretion whenever anyone pressed for details. Greg sat beside her, uncharacteristically silent, watching the room like he was counting exits. I raised my hand again and asked, on the record, when the last certified board election had taken place. Debbie said the board operated under continuity provisions, a phrase that existed nowhere in the actual covenant. Frank Torres nodded along like it meant something. Linda, beside them, stared very hard at her notepad. After the meeting, a small cluster of neighbors approached me, cautiously, the way people approach a fire they're not sure has gone out. Ruth was among them, along with a younger couple who'd been fined for a basketball hoop and a retired teacher fined for a wind spinner Debbie deemed excessive. They each had a story. Individually, together, they painted a portrait of a board that had turned petty enforcement into something closer to a protection racket. Comply quietly, pay your fines, or become the next name read aloud under fluorescent lights while your neighbors watched and said nothing. I started, carefully and unofficially, collecting statements not for a lawsuit yet, just for my own file, understanding the pattern mattered as much as any single violation. Small twist number 2 emerged here. My grandfather wasn't Debbie's most punished target. Ruth was, quietly, for over 4 years, and had simply never told anyone. Ruth admitted, almost apologetically, that she'd considered selling her house twice just to escape the constant scrutiny, the feeling of being watched by someone with a clipboard and a grudge. "I didn't want to make trouble," she said. "I just wanted to be left alone in my own yard." That sentence sat with me for days. An HO, in theory, existed to protect shared value and community standards. In practice, under Debbie, it had become a mechanism for one woman to punish anyone who didn't defer to her, dressed up in the neutral language of compliance and curb appeal. I began drafting something bigger than a records request, a formal petition for board recall, a legal mechanism buried deep in the original 1974 covenant that allowed homeowners to force new elections with a signed petition from a supermajority, 60% of residents in good standing. 60% was a high bar in a neighborhood conditioned into silence for years. I didn't know yet whether enough people would sign, or whether Debbie would find some pretext to invalidate the petition entirely. But for the first time, Maple Ridge had a legal path forward that didn't depend on her permission. I brought the idea to my grandfather that Sunday, spreading the covenant pages across his kitchen table like a battle map. He read the recall clause twice, slowly, then looked up at me with something I hadn't seen in his eyes in months. Not just hope, but purpose. "I helped write this," he said quietly, tapping the yellowed paper. "Never thought I'd need it against my own neighborhood." I told him this wasn't really his neighborhood anymore. Not the way Debbie ran it. It was hers, rented out to the rest of us through fear and fine print. He agreed to be the first signature on the recall petition, a decision that would put him directly in Debbie's crosshairs the moment she found out. I warned him of that risk plainly. He waved it off. "Landed at Incheon," he said. "A woman with a clipboard doesn't scare me." That confidence would be tested sooner than either of us expected. Because Debbie, sensing the tide quietly turning against her even without proof, was about to do something reckless, something that would take this fight out of hushed hallway conversations and into full public view, in front of the entire neighborhood. For a strange stretch of about 3 weeks, things at Maple Ridge went quiet. No new violation letters arrived. Debbie skipped one monthly walking inspection entirely, citing a family trip. My grandfather, cautiously, allowed himself to relax a little, tending his garden without glancing over his shoulder for the first time in months. I used the lull to keep working, quietly gathering signatures for the recall petition through one-on-one conversations rather than any public announcement, wary of tipping Debbie off before we had enough support to matter. Ruth proved invaluable, vouching for me door to door in a way an outside attorney never could. Slowly, cautiously, names accumulated: 12, then 20, then 31 out of Maple Ridge's roughly 90 homes. We needed 54 for the 60% threshold. It felt achievable, but only if word didn't spread too soon and give Debbie time to counter it before it reached critical mass. Linda continued forwarding documents in small, careful batches, always at night, always from personal accounts. One email thread showed Debbie discussing handling problem residents through the compliance process rather than direct confrontation, an oddly clinical phrase for what amounted to a strategy of harassment through paperwork. I began to understand Debbie's mind a little better through those documents. She wasn't chaotic or impulsive. She was methodical, controlled, allergic to any scenario where she wasn't the one holding the pen. The recall petition, if she discovered it, wouldn't just threaten her position, it would threaten her entire self-image. My grandfather used the quiet weeks to reconnect with a few old neighbors, inviting Ruth and the young couple with the basketball hoop over for coffee, trading stories about the neighborhood's early days before clipboards and compliance spotlights existed. For a little while, Maple Ridge felt like the place he remembered building. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that Debbie's son Tyler regularly parked an unregistered project car in their driveway, visibly rusted, missing a bumper, exactly the kind of unauthorized vehicle violation Debbie fined others for constantly. Nobody had ever cited it. I filed that detail away without comment. That small detail became small twist number 3 once I checked the violation records Linda had sent. Over 6 years, 17 residents had been fined for vehicle-related violations. None of those 17 were Debbie's household, despite Tyler's car sitting in plain view of every single walking inspection she personally conducted. I didn't confront anyone with it yet. Evidence, I'd learned long ago, is only powerful when it's complete and undeniable, not when it's fresh and exciting. I added it to the growing file, alongside the reserve fund discrepancies, the missing elections, and the illegally unfiled bylaws, building toward one decisive move rather than several small skirmishes. The petition count crept toward 40. I started reaching homeowners further from Ruth's immediate circle. Always in person, always careful. A retired firefighter named Otis signed without hesitation, telling me Debbie had once fined him for an improperly stored charcoal grill that had sat in that exact spot for a decade. Not everyone signed easily. A handful of residents worried openly about retaliation, about becoming Debbie's next spotlight if she somehow learned who'd signed first. I reassured them the petition process was confidential until formally submitted, per the covenant's own recall language, though I privately hoped Debbie wouldn't find a way to see it early. My grandfather, meanwhile, grew almost cheerful during the lull, humming while he trimmed the hedges, waving at passing cars the way he used to. I remember thinking, with real relief, that maybe the worst of it was actually over, that Debbie had quietly backed off after realizing she'd overreached with the lean threat. I should have known better, and always retreating. Sometimes they're simply repositioning, waiting for a moment when the target's guard drops low enough that the next strike lands harder than anything before it. Debbie, turned out, hadn't backed off at all. She'd been watching and planning. The trigger, when it came, wasn't the recall petition. She still didn't know about that. It was something smaller and far more personal. The annual Maple Ridge Memorial Day gathering, an informal potluck the neighborhood had held in the common green space every year since before the HOA even existed. My grandfather always brought the same dish, a barbecue recipe from my late grandmother, and always set up a small folding table near the flagpole with a framed photo of her beside it. Quiet, private tradition nobody had ever questioned. This year, Debbie decided the tradition needed board approval first. She sent a notice a week before Memorial Day announcing that personal displays and unauthorized food service in the common area required prior board authorization, citing liability concerns. It was, on paper, a new rule nobody had ever needed before, applied for the first time exactly when my grandfather's tradition was due. I read the notice and felt something shift in my chest. The specific fury of watching someone target grief itself as leverage. My grandfather, characteristically, tried to laugh it off. She wants to ban a barbecue and a photograph, he said. Let her. Underneath the joke this time. I advised him to attend anyway, photo and folding table and all, and to let me handle any confrontation if Debbie escalated in person. He agreed, though I sensed he wanted, on some level, to prove he wasn't afraid, an instinct that, in hindsight, walked him directly toward the worst moment of this entire ordeal. Memorial Day arrived warm and bright, the common green filling with grills and lawn chairs and children chasing each other around the flagpole. The kind of scene that made the neighborhood's earlier tension feel almost imaginary. My grandfather set up his folding table exactly where he always had, photo propped carefully against a small vase of flowers. Debbie arrived 20 minutes later with Greg and Frank Torres in tow, clipboard in hand even on a holiday, and walked directly toward my grandfather's table with the unmistakable posture of someone who'd rehearsed what she was about to say. I was 3 yards behind, having just arrived myself, and quickened my pace. "Walter, I need you to take this down," she said, loud enough for the nearest cluster of neighbors to hear. "You didn't file the display request." My grandfather looked at her, then at the photo of my grandmother, then back at her, and said simply, "It's a picture of my wife, Debbie." "Rules apply to everyone," she said, reaching toward the frame herself. My grandfather stepped slightly in front of the table, not aggressively, just protectively, and said, "Don't." It was one word, quiet, but it carried 30 years of a man defending something precious. Debbie's face flushed with something like offense at being told no. "Are you threatening me?" she said, her voice climbing, deliberately loud now, performing outrage for the gathering crowd rather than genuinely feeling it. Several neighbors turned to watch. My grandfather, flustered by the sudden audience, said nothing, which Debbie apparently read as an opening rather than restraint. "This is exactly the kind of entitled behavior this board has had to deal with for years," she announced to the crowd, gesturing at my grandfather like an exhibit. "Some people think being here longest means the rules don't apply to them." A murmur went through the gathering, uncomfortable, uncertain which way to lean. I reached the table just as she said it, and I watched my grandfather's face do something I'd never seen it do before. Not anger, not even hurt exactly, but a kind of public shrinking. A proud man realizing 30 people were now watching him get scolded like a child over his dead wife's photograph. "That's enough," I said, stepping in beside him. Debbie turned, recognizing me instantly, and her expression sharpened into something colder. "This doesn't concern you," she said. "It's a board matter." Calmly, that, as the resident's legal representative, concerned me entirely, and that she was one sentence away from a real problem. She laughed, short and dismissive, playing to the crowd again. "Oh, the granddaughter lawyer," she said, drawing air quotes around the word lawyer that didn't need air quotes. "Cute. Walter. Either the display comes down, or I document this as willful noncompliance, effective immediately, in front of witnesses." My grandfather's hands, I noticed, had started trembling slightly, not from fear but from the sheer effort of holding himself together in front of neighbors who'd known him for decades. He looked, for one terrible second, uncertain whether to fight or simply concede to make the humiliation stop. I made the decision for him. "Document whatever you'd like," I said evenly. "But before you do, you should know this board hasn't held a legally certified election in 6 years. Your bylaw amendments were never filed with the county, and a recall petition is already circulating. Every fine you've issued may be legally void. Think carefully before you add another. The words landed in the crowd like a dropped plate. Debbie's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: disbelief, calculation, and finally a brittle attempt at composure. "That's absurd," she said, but her voice had lost its earlier volume. Greg, beside her, had gone visibly pale. "It's not absurd," I said. "It's documented." Elderly resident's grief display in front of 30 witnesses on a holiday, which is a fantastic detail for the state's HOA ombudsman office to include in their file. I said it calmly, almost pleasantly, the way you deliver the worst news possible without raising your voice. Debbie didn't retreat gracefully. Cornered publicly, she doubled down instead, snapping that I was harassing the board and threatening legal action of her own for defamation, though her voice cracked slightly on the word defamation, betraying more panic than conviction. Around us, neighbors had stopped pretending not to watch. My grandfather, finally finding his footing again amid the chaos, said quietly but clearly, "Debbie, I helped build this neighborhood before you were born. I've paid every fine I could stomach paying. But I will not take down my wife's picture for you." The crowd's murmur shifted, audibly, toward sympathy. Debbie seemed to realize, a beat too late, that the room had turned. She grabbed Frank Torres's arm, muttered something about documenting this properly, and stalked off toward the parking lot, Greg trailing behind her, leaving my grandfather standing beside his folding table, shaking slightly, surrounded by neighbors who suddenly wanted to talk to him. Ruth reached us first, gripping my grandfather's arm gently. "I'm so sorry, Walter," she said. "That was disgusting." Others followed, the young couple with the basketball hoop, Otis the retired firefighter, even people I hadn't approached about the petition yet. The public humiliation, it seemed, had backfired spectacularly and immediately. I helped my grandfather sit down, checking on him quietly while neighbors hovered with the awkward sympathy of people who'd stayed silent too long themselves. He looked shaken but not broken, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried more resolve than grief. "Get me that petition," he said.
I want everyone.
That evening, footage someone had filmed on their phone during the confrontation started circulating in the neighborhood's private group chat. 38 seconds of Debbie calling my grandfather entitled over his dead wife's photograph, followed by his quiet, dignified refusal to back down. It spread fast. Faster than Debbie could control. By the next morning, the video had reached people well beyond Maple Ridge's private chat. Shared by a neighbor's teenage daughter onto a wider local community page with the caption, "Our HOA president screamed at an 82-year-old veteran over his late wife's photo." Comments filled with outrage within hours. I hadn't planned for viral exposure. It wasn't part of my legal strategy. And frankly, it worried me. Public pressure could complicate a clean legal process. But it did something invaluable regardless. It broke the silence that had protected Debbie for years, giving neighbors permission to finally say, out loud, what they'd quietly endured. Petition signatures, which had crawled from 12 to 40 over 6 slow weeks, jumped to 61 within 3 days of the video spreading. People who'd never spoken to me directly began reaching out themselves, describing their own finds, Their own silent compliance, now suddenly willing to put their names on paper. Debbie, predictably, went on the offensive rather than retreating. She posted a lengthy statement in the community newsletter accusing certain residents of orchestrating a smear campaign against dedicated volunteer leadership, insisting the video was deceptively edited and that context had been deliberately stripped from the confrontation. Few people believed her. She also, more troublingly, sent my grandfather a new letter within 48 hours, citing him for public disturbance during the Memorial Day gathering, and adding an additional $200 fine to his already frozen account. An act so transparently vindictive it read almost like a confession. I forwarded that letter directly into my growing legal file, flagging it explicitly as retaliatory action taken during an active governance dispute and records request, exactly the kind of conduct that, under Ohio's HOA statutes, could expose board members to personal liability rather than mere association liability. Linda Kwan reached out again that week, this time more shaken than cautious. Debbie, apparently sensing the walls closing in, had convened an emergency private board session without proper notice to homeowners, specifically to discuss handling the Doyle situation and identifying the source of the leaked financial concerns. Linda believed Debbie suspected her specifically, and she was terrified. I told her, honestly, that if things escalated the way I expected, whistleblower protections and her own documented cooperation would matter far more than any threat Debbie could make. Still, I understood her fear wasn't abstract. Debbie had already shown exactly what she was willing to do. That private session, held without proper notice, became small twist number 4 once details emerged. During it, Debbie proposed using association funds to hire a private investigator to look into hostile residents, specifically naming my grandfather and, chillingly, me. Linda voted no. Learning that Debbie had considered hiring an investigator to look into me personally sent a cold jolt through my usual professional composure. This wasn't just petty enforcement anymore. It was starting to resemble genuine intimidation, aimed not just at an elderly widower but at the attorney trying to help him. I documented the attempted investigator hiring immediately, along with Linda's dissenting vote, and began drafting a formal complaint to the state's HOA regulatory division, citing retaliation, improper board meeting procedures, unfiled bylaw amendments, and financial irregularities all in one consolidated filing rather than piecemeal complaints that could be dismissed individually. My grandfather, meanwhile, had become something of a quiet local figure after the video spread. Neighbors he hadn't spoken to in years stopped by with casseroles and apologies, several admitting they'd stayed silent through their own fines out of fear of becoming Debbie's next spotlight. Guilt, it seemed, was contagious once shame broke. He accepted their apologies graciously, though I noticed he'd grown more determined rather than softer through all of it. "I don't want sympathy," he told one neighbor bluntly. "I want this fixed properly, so nobody else has to stand where I stood." That sentiment, more than anger, became the engine driving everything I did next. Petition signatures crossed 70 by the following week, comfortably past the 54 required for a supermajority, though I held off submitting it formally, wanting the regulatory complaint and the recall to land together rather than giving Debbie separate fires to fight one at a time and possibly survive. Debbie, sensing momentum slipping entirely out of her hands, tried one more public maneuver, She scheduled an emergency general meeting, framing it as an opportunity to clear the air and correct misinformation about the Memorial Day incident, clearly hoping to regain narrative control before the situation slipped further. I decided to attend, this time not quietly in the back but prepared, file in hand, ready to formally raise the governance violations on the record in front of the full neighborhood rather than in private letters Debbie could simply ignore or bury. My grandfather insisted on coming too. Despite my gentle suggestion he sit this one out. I sat in the back long enough, he said, pulling on his good jacket, the one he wore to church and funerals. If she wants an audience, she can have one that actually knows the truth this time. I couldn't argue with that. And honestly, I didn't want to. The clubhouse was fuller than I'd ever seen it that evening. Word of the Memorial Day video having done more to drive attendance than any newsletter ever had. Debbie opened the meeting stiffly, reading a prepared statement about community healing that felt, to everyone in the room, obviously hollow and defensive. When she opened the floor for questions, I stood immediately, before anyone else could speak, and asked formally, on the record, whether the board could produce certified election records for any year within the past 6, per the association's original 1974 covenant requirements. The room went very quiet, waiting. Debbie repeated her earlier line about continuity provisions, but this time Frank Torres, visibly uncomfortable, didn't nod along. Someone in the crowd, Otis, the retired firefighter, called out, "That's not in the bylaws, Debbie." "I've read them." A ripple of agreement moved through the room. I followed up, presenting copies of the original covenant alongside the county recorder's confirmation that no bylaw amendments had ever been legally filed, distributing printed pages to nearby residents rather than simply describing them. Paper, I'd learned, convinced people faster than promises ever did. Debbie's composure cracked visibly for the first time in public. She insisted the documents were outdated and that the association operated under updated internal policy, though she couldn't produce that policy on the spot. And Linda, sitting silently at the board table, made no move to defend her. Greg finally spoke, attempting damage control, suggesting the meeting table this discussion for a proper legal review, a suggestion that, ironically, was the first sensible thing either of them had said all evening, though it came far too late to contain what was already unfolding in that room. I announced, then, that a homeowner recall petition currently held 72 signatures, 18 more than the required threshold, and would be formally submitted to the board within the week per the covenant's own recall procedure, triggering a mandatory new election within 60 days. The room erupted, not in anger exactly, but in something closer to disbelieving relief. The sound of people realizing collectively that the years of quiet compliance hadn't been permanent after all. Ruth, beside me, actually laughed out loud, a short, startled sound of pure vindication. Debbie tried to regain control, banging a small gavel she'd bought specifically for meetings, insisting the petition would be reviewed for validity before any action was taken. A phrase that sounded, to everyone present, exactly like a woman searching for any technicality to delay the inevitable. I told her, calmly and clearly, that the petition's validity was governed by the original recorded covenant, not board discretion, and that any attempt to Obstruct a properly submitted recall would itself constitute a further violation subject to state regulatory review, which I'd already initiated that week. My grandfather stood then, unprompted, and the room fell quiet again out of what felt like instinctive respect. "I built houses on this street before some of you were born," he said. "I've never asked for anything from this HOA except to be left in peace." "That's not what she gave me. She gave me a fine for a photograph of my wife," he continued, voice steady now, stronger than it had sounded at Memorial Day. "In front of my neighbors. On a holiday. Everything you need to know about the kind of leadership this neighborhood has actually had." The applause that followed wasn't loud. Exactly. But it was real. Dozens of neighbors nodding and clapping in the particular way people do when someone finally says out loud what everyone privately believed. Debbie stood frozen at the front table, gavel still in hand, visibly unsure what to do with a room she no longer controlled. The meeting ended shortly after, unofficially, as people simply began talking amongst themselves rather than waiting for Debbie to formally adjourn. Neighbors approached my grandfather in clusters, some to apologize, some simply to shake his hand. I watched him standing taller than he had in months, and something in my chest finally loosened. Driving home that night, I felt the particular satisfaction of watching momentum shift decisively in the right direction. But I also knew Debbie wasn't the type to accept a loss gracefully. Cornered people, especially controlling ones, don't usually surrender quietly. They usually do something far more reckless instead. I was right to worry. Debbie filed an emergency motion with the association's management company, attempting to invalidate the recall petition entirely, claiming, without evidence, that several signatures were fraudulent or coerced. It was a delay tactic, transparent and desperate, but delay tactics can still cause real damage if unchallenged. She followed that by mailing formal lien filing notices to 3 petition signers, including Ruth, citing decade-old minor violations nobody had ever previously enforced. A rose trellis, a garden statue, a slightly too tall fence post. The message was unmistakable. Sign against her, and she'd find something to punish you for too. Ruth called me in tears, more furious than frightened, describing exactly how personal the retaliation felt after everything she'd already endured quietly for years. I told her, honestly, that Debbie had just handed us the clearest evidence yet of retaliatory abuse of power, timestamped days after a public recall announcement. I filed an emergency addendum to my state regulatory complaint that same night, attaching the 3 retaliatory lien notices alongside dated proof of the petition submission, building a timeline so obvious that even a sympathetic reviewer would struggle to find Debbie's actions anything but deliberate and vindictive. My grandfather, watching Ruth and the others get targeted for supporting him, took it harder than his own harassment. "This is my fault," he said quietly one evening, and I had to remind him firmly that it wasn't, that Debbie's choices belonged to Debbie, not to the people brave enough to stand beside him. Debbie's behavior grew increasingly erratic over the following week, as if she sensed the ground shifting permanently beneath her and had decided reckless aggression was preferable to graceful surrender. She began driving past petition signers' houses slowly, clipboard visible on her dashboard, an unmistakable, almost theatrical form of intimidation. One neighbor reported Debbie photographing their trash cans through a car window at 7 in the morning, presumably searching for any violation. however minor, to justify further retaliatory fines. Another found a violation notice taped directly to their front door rather than mailed, an unusually aggressive departure from her normal process. I began advising petition signers to document everything themselves. Photographs, timestamps, any direct contact from Debbie or Greg, building a collective case rather than relying solely on my grandfather's experience. Several residents, emboldened rather than frightened now, started keeping detailed logs voluntarily, almost eager to contribute evidence. Small twist number 5 arrived through Linda that week. Debbie had quietly withdrawn nearly $6,000 from the association's operating account,
categorized in her private notes as legal defense retainer, despite never formally notifying the board or seeking approval for the expenditure. A clear violation of her own fiduciary duty.
Linda forwarded the withdrawal record along with a shaking apology for not catching it sooner, though I reassured her that catching it now, while it still mattered, was worth infinitely more than any earlier warning could have been. I added unauthorized fund withdrawal directly into the growing regulatory complaint. Meanwhile, Greg Voss began appearing at neighbors' doors personally, attempting a softer approach than his wife's, asking people to reconsider their petition signatures, framing Debbie as overworked and misunderstood rather than acknowledging any wrongdoing. Most residents, having already watched the Memorial Day video repeatedly, weren't persuaded. One resident, a younger homeowner named Priya, recorded her conversation with Greg discreetly, capturing him admitting, almost offhand, that the board probably should have held elections sooner, but insisting it never seemed necessary, since everyone trusted Debbie's judgment. It was, unintentionally, a confession recorded in his own voice. Priya sent me that recording immediately, understanding exactly what she'd captured. It wasn't dramatic, but it was devastating in its plainness. A sitting board member openly acknowledging, on tape, that legally required elections had simply been skipped because leadership assumed nobody would object. I added it to the file that night. My grandfather's fine balance, meanwhile, had ballooned past $900 through accumulated penalties, most added after the governance dispute officially began. A detail I highlighted specifically in my regulatory complaint as evidence of continued retaliatory billing during an active legal challenge to the board's authority. Debbie, apparently unaware or unconcerned that her retaliation was being carefully cataloged in real time, escalated further still. She had my grandfather's decades-old work truck, parked, as always, in his own driveway, reported to the city for unauthorized commercial vehicle storage, despite it having sat there unchanged for 15 years. A city code enforcement officer arrived unannounced one Thursday afternoon, and though the truck was ultimately deemed compliant under existing residential parking rules, the visit itself rattled my grandfather badly. The sense of being watched, reported, and hunted growing sharper with every passing week rather than fading. "She's not going to stop," he said that evening, sitting heavily in his recliner, looking older than his 82 years for the first time since this began. "Even losing, she keeps swinging." I told him that was exactly right, and exactly why we needed to finish this decisively rather than incrementally. That night, reviewing everything Linda, Priya, and the petition signers had provided, I realized the case had grown far larger than a single grieving man's flag or a single unpaid fine. It was, cumulatively, a pattern of financial mismanagement, unauthorized authority, and retaliatory abuse spanning years, affecting dozens of families quietly harmed along the way. I decided to expand the state regulatory complaint into a formal emergency filing, requesting not just review but immediate suspension of the boards, fine collection and lien authority pending investigation, an aggressive request, but one I believed the evidence, now voluminous, could genuinely support. Debbie, sensing the walls tightening further, made her most reckless move yet. She had my grandfather's memorial garden flag physically removed from his yard while he was at a doctor's appointment, sending Frank Torres to do it personally, later claiming it constituted abandoned unauthorized property, left unattended on association-adjacent common space. My grandfather came home to find the flag simply gone. No notice given beforehand this time. Just an empty spot where my grandmother's memorial had stood for 8 months. He called me immediately, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, I heard something in his voice that wasn't anger. It was grief, raw and fresh again. I drove over within 20 minutes, finding him standing motionless in his own yard, staring at the empty patch of grass. "They took her," he said quietly, and though I understood he meant the flag, the phrasing hit me like a blow, because in a sense, Debbie had reopened a wound none of us had fully healed. That moment, more than any legal violation, more than any withheld election or misappropriated fund, was the one that hardened something permanent in me. This wasn't about clean legal victories anymore. Not entirely. It was personal now, and I intended to make sure Debbie understood exactly how badly she'd miscalculated. I filed a police report for the flag's removal, though I understood a civil resolution was far more likely than any criminal charge, and I documented the incident meticulously for the regulatory complaint, framing it explicitly as retaliatory destruction of a grieving resident's memorial during an active governance dispute. News of the flag's removal spread through the neighborhood almost instantly, faster even than the Memorial Day video had, carried this time by sheer outrage rather than curiosity. Neighbors who'd remained cautiously neutral finally, decisively, chose sides. Petition signatures, already past threshold, climbed to 84 out of 90 homes. Ruth organized an informal candlelight gathering outside my grandfather's house that weekend, neighbors bringing flowers and small memorial tokens to replace what Debbie had taken. An unplanned but powerful demonstration of exactly how thoroughly the community had turned against the woman who'd once controlled it through fear. My grandfather, overwhelmed by the gesture, stood on his porch that evening surrounded by neighbors holding candles, and for the first time since Memorial Day, he cried openly, not from sorrow exactly, but from the sheer relief of finally, visibly, not standing alone against something that had felt impossibly large for months. Debbie did not attend, of course, though several witnesses reported her car slowing as it passed the gathering before speeding up again and disappearing around the corner. Whether from shame or fury, nobody could say for certain. Either way, it was the last time she'd drive past that street feeling any real power over it. I finalized the emergency regulatory filing that week. The thick, meticulously organized packet, unfiled bylaws, skipped elections, misappropriated reserve funds, the unauthorized $6,000 withdrawal, Greg's recorded admission, retaliatory liens against petition signers, and now, the deliberate destruction of a grieving resident's memorial. I submitted it directly to the state's HOA ombudsman office. Alongside it, I formally submitted the recall petition to the association's management company, 84 signatures strong, invoking the original covenants, mandatory 60-day new election clause, a legal trigger Debbie could delay but, given everything else now on record, could no longer plausibly block outright. Debbie's response arrived within days. A lawyer-drafted letter attempting to characterize the entire situation as a personal vendetta orchestrated by a disgruntled attorney granddaughter against dedicated community leadership. It read less like a legal argument and more like a woman watching her authority evaporate in slow motion, grasping at any available narrative. Her lawyer, notably, didn't address a single specific allegation directly. Not the unfiled bylaws, not the missing elections, not the fund withdrawal. The letter simply asserted, broadly, that the board had acted in good faith at all times, a phrase that, given the mounting evidence, felt almost laughably insufficient. Small twist number 6 emerged here, unexpected and satisfying. The state ombudsman's office responded faster than I anticipated, informing me they'd already received 2 prior, independent complaints against Maple Ridge's board within the past year, from Ruth, filed quietly months earlier, and from an anonymous source I strongly suspected was Linda. Debbie hadn't just been risking exposure from my grandfather's case. She'd been sitting on a slow-burning regulatory fuse for months already, one she apparently didn't know existed, unaware that her pattern of behavior had already drawn official attention before Memorial Day ever happened. The investigation, once launched, moved considerably faster as a result. Greg Voss, meanwhile, appeared to be distancing himself visibly from his wife's decisions, no longer accompanying her on walking inspections, skipping the most recent informal board huddle entirely. Priya mentioned seeing him alone at the community mailbox, looking, in her words, like a man already mentally packing boxes. Debbie, isolated even within her own household's alliance, grew visibly more desperate rather than more cautious. She scheduled an unannounced compliance sweep of the entire neighborhood, sending Frank Torres door-to-door photographing violations without warning, an act several residents rightly interpreted as one final, futile assertion of control. Frank, notably, only made it through 6 houses before quietly abandoning the sweep entirely, later admitting to Ruth over her fence that he didn't feel right about it anymore, and hadn't for weeks, but had been too intimidated by Debbie's temper to say so directly until now. That admission, small as it seemed, mattered enormously. Frank had been Debbie's most reliable yes vote for years, and his quiet defection signaled, more clearly than any petition count, that her authority had crumbled even among the people closest to her, leaving her almost entirely alone at the top of a board that no longer functioned. I received formal confirmation that week that the state ombudsman's office was opening a full investigation into Maple Ridge's HOA, encompassing financial mismanagement, improper governance, and retaliatory enforcement, with a preliminary hearing scheduled within 30 days, a timeline far faster than I'd initially expected for a case this complex. Debbie, informed of the investigation by the management company, reportedly reacted with fury rather than fear initially, according to Linda, insisting the complaints were coordinated harassment, and vowing to fight this to the end. My grandfather, hearing that secondhand, simply nodded slowly. Let her, he said. "I've got nowhere else to be," in a final, almost self-destructive act of defiance. Debbie called an emergency board meeting, without proper notice, again attempting to push through a resolution declaring the recall. Petition invalid due to procedural irregularities, she refused to specify, hoping, apparently, to manufacture a technicality before the state investigation could formally intervene. Linda, the sole board member still attending in good conscience, refused to vote, stating on the record that she believed the resolution itself violated proper meeting notice requirements and represented exactly the kind of governance failure already under state review. Her refusal, documented in board minutes, became crucial evidence days later. Debbie and Frank pushed the resolution through anyway. 2 votes against Linda's recorded objection and Greg's conspicuous absence, technically passing a measure that legally meant nothing given the improper notice and the board's already compromised authority. It was, in every meaningful sense, the act of a woman governing a kingdom that no longer existed. I received word of that improperly noticed emergency vote within hours, courtesy of Linda, and folded it immediately into the regulatory filing as fresh, damning evidence of continued procedural violations occurring in real time, even after formal state investigation had already begun. Debbie, remarkably, kept handing us exactly what we needed. By early the following week, the neighborhood existed in a strange, charged limbo, Debbie technically still holding the title of board president, functionally commanding almost no remaining authority or loyalty, while 84 homeowners, a state investigation, and a mountain of documented misconduct quietly closed in around her from every direction at once. I spent that week preparing meticulously for the Ombudsman's preliminary hearing, organizing the file into a clear, chronological narrative rather than a scattered pile of complaints, unfiled bylaws first, then skipped elections, then financial irregularities, then the escalating pattern of retaliation culminating in the memorial flag's destruction. My grandfather insisted on attending the hearing personally, despite my gentle suggestion that a written statement might spare him additional stress. "I've sat quiet enough times in this whole business," he said, pulling out his good jacket again. "I'd like to look her in the eye one more time, properly." Ruth and several other petition signers requested to attend as well, wanting to witness the process firsthand after years of feeling powerless against it. I welcomed their presence, understanding that a room full of quietly resolute homeowners would communicate something to the hearing officer that paperwork alone never could. Linda agreed, after considerable hesitation, to testify formally rather than simply provide documents, understanding that her first-hand account of Debbie's fund withdrawals and skipped elections carried a weight no spreadsheet could replicate on its own. Her hands, she admitted quietly, hadn't stopped shaking since she agreed. I reassured her repeatedly that Ohio's whistleblower protections, combined with her documented good faith dissent in the board minutes, positioned herfra better than she feared, though I understood completely that legal protection and personal courage were 2 very different things to summon in the same moment. Priya's recorded conversation with Greg presented its own complications. Recording laws required certain disclosures I needed to verify carefully before submitting.
It is formal evidence. Wanting nothing about our case to rest on a technicality Debbie's lawyer could later exploit to discredit otherwise damning material.
After confirming the recording met Ohio's one-party consent requirements, I included it in the final evidentiary packet, alongside time-stamped photographs of the empty memorial spot. Ruth's 4 years of accumulated fine notices, and the unauthorized $6,000 withdrawal Linda had traced directly to Debbie's personal signature authorization. My grandfather spent an evening writing his own statement by hand, refusing my offer to draft something more polished on his behalf. "I want it in my words," he said, and when he finally showed it to me, simple and unpolished, it moved me more than anything I could have written myself. He wrote about building the neighborhood in 1974, about raising his children on that street, about losing my grandmother 8 months earlier, and about standing in his own yard while a stranger called him entitled for grieving quietly in public. It wasn't legal argument. It was simply, devastatingly, true. Debbie, meanwhile, hired a more aggressive attorney ahead of the hearing, one who specialized, according to Linda's nervous update, in association liability defense, suggesting Debbie finally understood the scale of exposure she faced but had chosen combativeness over any genuine attempt at accountability or resolution. That attorney sent a preemptive letter to the Ombudsman's office arguing the entire investigation stemmed from a personal dispute weaponized by a hostile family member,
specifically naming me, attempting to frame my legal advocacy as improper interference rather than legitimate representation of a harmed resident.
I responded formally, noting for the record that representing a family member as their attorney was neither unusual nor improper, and that the extensive documented evidence, financial records, recorded admissions, whistleblower testimony, existed entirely independent of any personal relationship between myself and the resident in question. The hearing officer, reviewing preliminary filings ahead of the formal session, requested additional documentation specifically regarding the reserve fund withdrawals, a request that sent a visible ripple of anxiety through Debbie's camp according to Linda, who reported Debbie had spent an entire evening on the phone with her attorney afterward. My grandfather, in the days leading up to the hearing, seemed to settle into a strange, steady calm, the anxious tension of previous months replaced by something closer to quiet resolve. "Whatever happens now," he told me, "at least it's finally out in the open. That matters more than winning." Almost. I didn't fully agree. I very much intended to win, but I understood what he meant. Years of quiet harassment thrive specifically on secrecy and shame, on victims believing they're alone in their experience. Simply dragging Debbie's pattern into daylight had already, in some sense, broken her primary weapon. Small twist number 7 arrived 4 days before the hearing. Frank Torres, Debbie's longtime yes vote, contacted me directly, unprompted, offering to provide a signed statement corroborating Linda's account of the skipped elections and the pressure Debbie routinely applied to board votes, including his own reluctant compliance for years. Frank admitted, almost apologetically, that he'd gone along with Debbie's decisions out of simple conflict avoidance rather than genuine agreement, and that watching Frank himself abandon the compliance sweep weeks earlier had finally clarified, for him, exactly how far things had drifted from anything resembling legitimate community governance. His statement, combined with Linda's, meant 2 of Debbie's own board members would now testify against her practices, a detail that, once it reached Debbie, through the management company's disclosure requirements, reportedly triggered a furious, hours-long phone call to Frank that he described afterward as unhinged. Debbie's attorney, apparently spent the following days attempting damage control, reportedly urging her to consider a negotiated resolution rather than proceeding to a full hearing where mounting internal defections made a favorable outcome increasingly unlikely. Debbie, according to Linda, refused outright, insisting she'd done nothing wrong. That refusal to consider any resolution short of total vindication struck me as the clearest evidence yet of exactly the personality trait that had created
this entire situation, an inability to accept fault, even when every available fact pointed directly and repeatedly toward her own documented misconduct.
I finalized my presentation for the hearing that weekend, organizing exhibits, preparing my grandfather and Linda and Frank for what to expect, and reviewing Ohio's specific statutory penalties for HOA board members found to have engaged in financial misconduct or retaliatory enforcement against residents exercising legal rights. Those penalties, I explained carefully to my grandfather, could include removal from the board, personal financial liability for misappropriated funds, and in cases of sufficiently egregious conduct, referral for further legal action beyond the regulatory process itself. He listened quietly, then simply said, "Good." The night before the hearing, I sat with my grandfather on his porch one last time, the same porch he'd built the frame for decades earlier, and asked him, honestly, whether he had any regrets about how far this had gone. He considered it for a long moment before answering. "I regret waiting so long to fight back," he said finally. "I thought staying quiet was dignity. Turns out it was just fear wearing a nicer word. I didn't have a response for that. Not really. So I just sat with him quietly until the porch light drew the first moths of evening. Ruth called that same night, nervous but resolute, confirming she'd be there in the morning alongside several other petition signers, wanting to physically demonstrate to the hearing officer exactly how many residents had lived under Debbie's particular version of leadership for far longer than anyone should have had to. I barely slept, running through the presentation order in my head, timeline first, financial evidence second, whistleblower testimony third, retaliation pattern last, building deliberately toward the memorial flag's destruction as the emotional and legal centerpiece of an otherwise carefully documented pattern of institutional abuse. Debbie, according to a final update from Linda late that night, had spent the evening drafting her own opening statement, reportedly still framing herself as a dedicated volunteer unfairly targeted by a coordinated smear campaign, seemingly unable, even now, to recognize how thoroughly her own actions had built this outcome. Small twist number 8 surfaced that final night. Almost incidentally, Linda mentioned, in passing, that the mysterious consulting company receiving those unexplained reserve fund payments traced back to a business address registered under Greg Voss's brother, a detail Linda had only just confirmed through a public business filing search. That single detail transformed vague financial irregularity into something considerably starker: money moving from homeowner dues into the pocket of Debbie's
Own extended family, disguised as legitimate consulting fees, over a period spanning nearly 3 years without a single homeowner's knowledge or approval.
I added the business filing documentation to my exhibits immediately, understanding it would likely be the single most damaging piece of evidence in the entire hearing, transforming the narrative from overzealous enforcement into something considerably closer to actual embezzlement disguised behind official-sounding paperwork. My grandfather, when I told him, simply shook his head slowly. "All this," he said, over a flag and a hose and a fence. And the whole time she was skimming money into her own family's pocket. He laughed once, short and disbelieving. At least now it makes a kind of sense. I spent the final hours before the hearing rehearsing my opening statement quietly in my kitchen, wanting every sentence to land with the precision this case deserved after everything my grandfather, Ruth, Linda, and dozens of quiet Maple Ridge residents had endured across years of unchecked, unquestioned authority. By the time morning arrived, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel throughout this entire ordeal. Genuine, grounded confidence. Not hope exactly, which can be fragile, but the specific steadiness that comes from knowing the evidence thoroughly, completely, and understanding exactly how to present it. The hearing took place in a modest county administrative building downtown, a far cry from the fluorescent-lit clubhouse where so much of this had unfolded. But the stakes inside felt enormous regardless. My grandfather wore his good jacket. Ruth sat beside him. Linda arrived early, visibly nervous but present. Debbie arrived with her attorney, sharply dressed, composed on the surface in a way that only made the tension underneath more obvious to anyone who'd watched her unravel these past months. Greg was notably absent. Frank Torres sat, uncomfortably, on our side of the room rather than beside his board president. The hearing officer, a measured woman named Ms. Alvarez, opened by outlining the scope: allegations of improper governance, unfiled bylaw amendments, skipped elections, financial mismanagement, and retaliatory enforcement against residents exercising legal rights. She invited opening statements, beginning with the complainant's side. I stood and walked through the timeline methodically, starting with the original 1974 covenant, the missing county filings, the 6 years without certified elections, moving deliberately toward the financial irregularities before ever mentioning my grandfather's personal experience, wanting the systemic pattern established before the emotional core arrived. Debbie's attorney objected periodically, mostly procedural, mostly overruled, each objection landing with slightly less force than the last as the sheer volume of documented evidence made personal vendetta, an increasingly untenable defense theory in front of a hearing officer clearly building her own independent read of the facts. Linda testified next, her voice shaking initially before steadying as she walked through the skipped elections year by year, the pressure Debbie applied during board discussions, and finally, the unauthorized $6,000 withdrawal she traced directly to Debbie's personal signature authorization without board approval. Debbie's attorney attempted to characterize Linda's testimony as the resentful account of a disgruntled colleague, but Linda's calm, specific, date-stamped recollection undercut that framing almost immediately. Ms. steadily throughout, occasionally asking Linda to clarify specific transaction dates. Frank testified next, admitting plainly that he'd voted alongside Debbie for years primarily out of conflict avoidance, and that he'd personally witnessed her instruct Linda to adjust the presentation of financial figures before annual meetings on at least 3 separate occasions he could specifically recall and date. Debbie's face, watching her own longtime ally testify against her, hardened into something brittle and furious, though her attorney kept a firm hand on her arm, clearly urging restraint. She said nothing during Frank's testimony, but her knuckles, gripping the edge of the table, had gone visibly white. Priya's recorded conversation with Greg played next. His own voice filling the small hearing room, admitting elections probably should have happened, admitting nobody had questioned it because everyone trusted Debbie's judgment. Hearing it played aloud, in context, in an official proceeding, landed with far more weight than the recording alone ever had.
Several pointed follow-up questions about the reserve fund withdrawals specifically, and I presented the business filing documentation connecting the consulting company to Greg's brother, watching the hearing officer's expression shift, subtly but unmistakably, from measured neutrality toward something closer to genuine concern.
Debbie's attorney, sensing the hearing's momentum turning decisively unfavorable, requested a brief recess to confer privately with his client. MS. 10 minutes. During that recess, I watched Debbie through the hallway window, gesturing sharply at her attorney, clearly no longer following whatever advice he was offering. When the hearing resumed, Debbie's attorney announced, somewhat stiffly, that his client wished to make a personal statement rather than continue through formal questioning. A request Ms. Alvarez allowed cautiously, noting it would still be considered part of the official record regardless of format. Debbie stood, smoothing her blazer, and began by insisting she'd only ever wanted what was best for Maple Ridge. That enforcement, however strict, had genuinely protected property values, and that the financial arrangements in question represented legitimate consulting expenses she characterized as entirely within her discretion as board president. She never once, throughout her entire statement, acknowledged the memorial flag, the skipped elections, or the connection between the consulting payments and her husband's brother, an omission so glaring that even her own attorney visibly winced at one point, clearly recognizing exactly how badly this was landing with the hearing officer. My grandfather, watching her speak, sat perfectly still, jaw tight, until Ms. Alvarez finally turned to him and asked, gently, whether he wished to add anything to the record himself. He stood slowly, unfolded the handwritten statement he'd written days earlier, and began reading it aloud, voice steady despite everything. He spoke about 1974, about pouring concrete for houses that still stood decades later, about raising his family on that street, about losing my grandmother 8 months earlier and hanging a small blue ribbon in her memory. Then he described Memorial Day, the clipboard, the accusation of entitlement, the humiliation in front of neighbors. I have been called many things in my life, he said, voice thickening slightly but never breaking. Soldier. Neighbor. Nobody ever called me entitled until a woman with a clipboard decided my grief violated her curb appeal standards. The room, including Ms. Alvarez, sat in absolute silence. He finished by describing coming home to find the flag physically removed while he was at a doctor's appointment. No notice given, simply gone. And the moment he'd stood in his own yard staring at empty grass where his wife's memorial had been. That wasn't governance, he said.
That was cruelty.
Him quietly, her professional composure visibly softened for the first time all morning. She asked Debbie directly whether she disputed having ordered the flag's removal. Debbie, after a long pause, admitted she had, framing it again as enforcement of unauthorized display standards, rather than acknowledging any personal cruelty.
During an active governance dispute, Ms. Alvarez said, "Not quite a question. More a statement laid carefully on the record. You ordered the physical removal of a grieving resident's memorial display without notice, while formal complaints regarding your conduct were already pending before this office." Debbie's attorney said nothing. The hearing moved into closing arguments shortly after, and I made my final point deliberately simple. Every fine, every lien, every retaliatory action rested on authority the board had never legitimately renewed in 6 years, compounded by financial misconduct benefiting Debbie's own extended family and capped by deliberate cruelty toward a grieving widower. Debbie's attorney's closing argument, by contrast, felt noticeably thinner, focusing mostly on procedural technicalities regarding petition signature verification rather than addressing the substantive misconduct directly, an approach that, given everything already on the record, felt less like strategy and more like simply having nothing else left to say.
She would issue a formal written ruling within 10 business days, per standard procedure, but noted, unusually, that given the severity and breadth of documented violations, she would also be forwarding elements of the case to the county prosecutor's office for potential review of the fund misappropriation.
That statement alone sent a visible jolt through the room. Debbie's attorney leaned in urgently to whisper something to her. Debbie herself went pale, the performed composure finally, completely cracking as the reality of actual legal consequence, beyond mere board removal, settled visibly across her face for the first time. We left the hearing that afternoon in a strange, suspended quiet, none of us quite ready to celebrate until the formal ruling arrived, but all of us aware something fundamental had shifted permanently. My grandfather squeezed my hand in the parking lot and simply said, "Thank you for believing me before you had proof." Word of the hearing spread through Maple Ridge within hours. Ruth and Priya both texting updates to the wider petition group chat, careful not to overstate the outcome before the official ruling but unable, understandably, to fully contain their optimism given how visibly the hearing had gone against Debbie. Debbie, according to Linda's next update, spent the following days in what could only be described as a state of controlled panic, calling her attorney repeatedly, reportedly exploring whether resigning voluntarily before the formal ruling might soften any eventual county prosecutor involvement regarding the fund withdrawals. Her attorney, apparently, advised exactly that, a preemptive resignation, framed publicly as stepping back to allow the community to heal, a face-saving exit strategy that would have let Debbie avoid the specific humiliation of formal, documented removal. Debbie, predictably, resisted the idea initially, unwilling to concede defeat voluntarily. Small twist number 9 arrived here, the most unexpected yet. Greg Voss, without consulting Debbie, quietly reached out to the association's management company himself, requesting his own immediate resignation from the treasurer position, along with a personal statement distancing himself explicitly from the consulting payments tied to his brother. Greg's statement, when Linda forwarded it to me, admitted he'd encouraged the arrangement with his brother's company without fully considering how it might appear, a carefully lawyered admission that nonetheless represented the first crack of genuine individual accountability from anyone inside Debbie's inner circle. Debbie, learning of her own husband's unilateral resignation and admission, reportedly reacted with fury rather than solidarity. According to Linda, who described a shouting match audible from Linda's own driveway 2 houses down, ending with Greg apparently moving into a hotel for several nights afterward. That detail, small and human amid everything else, reminded me that beneath the clipboards and fines and financial schemes, this had always ultimately been about one person's need for total, unquestioned control, a need that, once genuinely challenged, seemed to be dismantling not just her authority but her own household along with it.
And a formal written ruling arrived 9 days after the hearing, a detailed document running 11 pages, methodically confirming nearly every allegation, unfiled bylaw amendments rendering years of enforcement void, 6 years without legally required elections, unauthorized fund disbursement to a business connected to a board member's family, and documented retaliatory conduct.
The ruling ordered immediate suspension of the board's authority to levy fines or file liens pending a properly conducted new election, mandated within 45 days under direct county oversight rather than association self-administration, and formally voided every fine issued against my grandfather, Ruth, and the other petition signers retroactively. It also referred the reserve fund withdrawal specifically to the county prosecutor's office for further review, citing potential fiduciary breach and possible misappropriation, language considerably more serious than the governance irregularities framing Debbie's attorney had spent weeks trying to establish throughout the process. I read the ruling twice at my kitchen table before calling my grandfather, wanting to be absolutely certain of every detail before delivering news this significant. When I finally called, I read him the key findings slowly, and I heard him exhale, long and shaking, on the other end of the line. "Every fine voided?" he asked, needing to hear it confirmed directly. "Every single one," I told him. "Retroactively. It never should have existed in the first place." He was quiet for a long moment before saying, softly, "Your grandmother would have liked watching this unfold, I think. She never trusted that woman either." News of the formal ruling spread through Maple Ridge almost immediately once the management company was legally required to notify all homeowners, and the reaction across the neighborhood's group chats ranged from relief to outright celebration. Years of quiet compliance finally, officially, vindicated by an outside authority nobody could dismiss. Debbie, informed of the ruling directly, reportedly locked herself inside her house for most of that first day, refusing calls even from her own attorney, according to Linda, who'd heard secondhand from a neighbor who'd knocked to check on her and received no answer at all. Frank Torres resigned from the board within hours of the ruling's release, releasing a brief public statement to the newsletter acknowledging he should have spoken up years earlier and apologizing directly to residents, including my grandfather, for going along with decisions I knew weren't right. By that evening, the board Debbie had built and controlled for 6 uncontested years had effectively ceased to exist in any functional sense. Greg resigned, Frank resigned, Linda remaining only as a caretaker signatory to maintain basic operations, and Debbie herself isolated, unresponsive, and facing a county investigation into her own finances. The county-supervised special election was scheduled for 6 weeks out, with an independent monitor assigned to oversee ballot distribution and vote certification, ensuring nothing resembling Debbie's original unopposed uncontested rise to power could quietly repeat itself under whatever leadership emerged next. My grandfather, somewhat to my surprise, agreed to run for a board seat himself, not for president, but for the position Linda would be vacating once new leadership was properly seated. Somebody who actually helped build this place should have a say in how it's run, he told me. Might as well be me. Ruth agreed to run for president. Encouraged heavily by petition signers who'd watched her steady, patient leadership throughout the entire ordeal, from quiet door-to-door signature gathering to organizing the candlelight gathering after the flag's removal. She accepted, nervously but genuinely, understanding the neighborhood needed steady hands after Debbie's chaos. Debbie, notably, did not file to run in the special election at all, the deadline passing without her name appearing anywhere on the ballot. Quiet, almost anticlimactic surrender after months of aggressive resistance to every single step of accountability that had led to this moment. The county prosecutor's office, meanwhile, moved forward with its own review of the reserve fund withdrawals, requesting Debbie's personal financial records related to the consulting payments, a formal step that, according to local news coverage picking up the story, suggested charges of theft or fraud remained genuinely under consideration. A local news outlet, having noticed the earlier viral Memorial Day video, ran a short segment on the unfolding Maple Ridge situation, interviewing several residents including Ruth and, briefly, my grandfather himself, who spoke calmly on camera about grief, dignity, and the specific danger of unchecked authority in small communities. The segment brought renewed attention to the neighborhood, mostly sympathetic, though a few comments online questioned why it had taken so long for anyone to challenge Debbie's authority in the first place. My grandfather, watching the coverage himself, simply said, "Fear's a slow poison. Takes a while before anyone notices they're sick." Debbie's house, meanwhile, sat conspicuously quiet through all of this, blinds drawn, no car in the driveway most days according to neighbors. The woman who'd once walked every street with a clipboard and absolute confidence now apparently avoiding the very community she'd spent 6 years attempting to control entirely. Linda, in her final weeks as caretaker treasurer, worked closely with the county-appointed monitor to reconcile the association's actual financial records, discovering, in the process, an additional and previously unnoticed pattern. Debbie had also been quietly waiving her own household's assessment fees for the past 2 years without board knowledge. That final discovery, small twist number 10, arriving almost as an afterthought after everything else, still managed to land with real weight. The woman who'd fined neighbors relentlessly over gnomes and hoses and grieving photographs hadn't been paying her own dues in full for 2 years running. Linda forwarded that finding to both me and the county monitor immediately, and it was folded into the ongoing prosecutor's review as additional evidence of a broader pattern rather than isolated misconduct, not a single lapse in judgment, but a sustained, years-long practice of exempting herself from the very rules she'd weaponized against everyone else. My grandfather, hearing about the waived fees, actually laughed for the first time in weeks. A real, unguarded laugh. "Of course she didn't pay her own dues," he said, shaking his head. "Woman fined me for a flag and skipped her own bill the whole time. There's a word for that. Actually, the special election, when it finally arrived, drew a turnout unlike anything Maple Ridge had seen in years, nearly every household submitting a ballot under the county. monitors careful supervision, a stark contrast to the unanimous, single-candidate vote that had first installed Debbie 6 years earlier without any real contest at all. Ruth won the presidency decisively, and my grandfather secured his seat comfortably as well, alongside 2 other newly nominated residents committed, publicly, to restoring the transparency and quiet trust the neighborhood had operated under for decades before Debbie's arrival ever disrupted it. At the first officially certified board meeting under the new leadership, held in the same clubhouse where so much of this had unfolded, Ruth opened by formally rescinding every unfiled policy Debbie's board had ever attempted to enforce, restoring the original 1974 covenant as the neighborhood's sole governing document until proper amendments could be legally passed. My grandfather, sitting at the board table this time rather than the back row, watched the room fill with neighbors who no longer flinched at the sight of a clipboard, and something in his posture, I noticed from where I sat, had settled into a kind of quiet, permanent ease. The county prosecutor's office announced its findings roughly 2 months later. Sufficient evidence existed to pursue charges against Debbie for misuse of association funds.
Specifically, the payments routed to her husband's brother's shell consulting entity, totaling just over $14,000 accumulated across nearly 3 years of undisclosed disbursements.
Debbie was formally charged with theft in office and record falsification related to association financial disclosures. Charges that, if convicted, carried the possibility of restitution, fines, and potential jail time depending on how the court weighed the total amount and the sustained duration of the misconduct. News of the charges spread through Maple Ridge with a kind of subdued, exhausted satisfaction rather than celebration exactly. Most residents, my grandfather included, seemed more relieved than triumphant, having spent months hoping simply for accountability rather than any particular punishment beyond that. Debbie's attorney entered negotiations with the prosecutor's office almost immediately, and within weeks, a plea agreement emerged. Debbie would plead guilty to a reduced charge, pay full restitution of the misappropriated funds plus penalties, complete community service, and accept a permanent, formal ban from serving on any homeowners association board within the state. My grandfather read that final detail twice when I told him. A lifetime ban from HOA board service, and nodded slowly, satisfied in a quiet way that felt more like closure than victory. Good, he said. Let her go be entitled somewhere she can't hurt anyone with a clipboard again. Greg and Debbie's marriage, according to neighborhood word that filtered back through Linda, did not survive the ordeal either. Greg filing for divorce quietly a few months after his own resignation, apparently unwilling to remain tied, personally or financially, to the consequences still unfolding around his wife's choices. Debbie ultimately sold her Maple Ridge house within the year, moving out of the neighborhood entirely, the property changing hands to a young family who, according to Ruth, seemed entirely unaware of the drama the house's previous owner had generated across 6 turbulent years of unchecked authority. My grandfather watched the moving truck pull away from her old driveway one afternoon, standing quietly at the edge of his own yard, and told me afterward it felt less satisfying than he'd expected, more like watching weather finally clear after a long, exhausting storm than any real sense of triumph. I didn't want to destroy her, he said. I just wanted her to stop. I told him that was, in a strange way, exactly what accountability was supposed to feel like. Not vengeance, just consequence, finally landing where it had always belonged after years of being deflected onto everyone except the person responsible. Ruth's presidency settled the neighborhood back into something resembling its earlier, quieter rhythm, reasonable enforcement, genuine transparency, actual elections held on schedule, and a noticeable absence of anyone reading violator names aloud like a scoreboard during otherwise routine community meetings. My grandfather replanted a new memorial flag that spring, the same small blue ribbon design, in the exact spot where the original had once stood. And this time, nobody photographed it, nobody threatened it, nobody suggested it violated anything at all. Simply stayed, quietly, exactly where it belonged. Linda remained on the new board briefly before eventually stepping back entirely, telling me once, gratefully, that she finally felt able to sleep through the night without dreading what number she might be asked to quietly adjust before the next annual meeting arrived on the calendar. A year after the Memorial Day confrontation that started this entire unraveling, Maple Ridge held its potluck gathering again, larger than ever, neighbors setting up tables and grills across the common green without a single clipboard in sight. The flagpole standing exactly where it always had, watching over a neighborhood that had, finally, healed. My grandfather brought my grandmother's barbecue recipe again that year, setting his folding table up near the flagpole exactly as he always had, the framed photo beside it undisturbed. And this time, neighbor after neighbor stopped by not out of obligation, but simply to share a plate and a memory with him. Ruth gave a short, unscripted speech before the meal began, thanking the community for finally finding its voice again, and thanking, specifically, a stubborn old veteran and his even more stubborn granddaughter for reminding everyone that quiet dignity, given enough time and enough courage, eventually finds its own justice. I stood beside my grandfather that afternoon, watching him laugh with neighbors who'd once avoided him at the mailbox out of fear, and understood, fully, that this had never really been about legal statutes or petition thresholds at all. It had simply been about one man's right to grieve, undisturbed, in his own yard. Debbie Voss. As far as anyone in Maple Ridge ever heard again. Moved 2 counties over. Banned for life from HOA leadership anywhere in the state. Her name quietly becoming shorthand among neighbors for exactly the kind of authority nobody should ever hand over unchecked, uncontested, or unquestioned again. My grandfather still tends that little blue ribbon every spring, and every time I visit, he tells me the same thing, smiling into his coffee the way he did before any of this began. Built this street with my own hands, Sarah. Turns out I helped save it too. The END.